Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. Government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
So really quick, wanted to introduce a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, Tino Perez. And so we've been working on getting Tino here for about a year. A little background on Tino. Tino is the Associate Professor and Chair of the Executive and Strategic Leadership at the Army War College. As part of that, he directs the Carlisle Scholars Program, which emphasizes problem-based learning as essential student experience. For this program, he won the Army War College Excellence in Service Award in 2021. And he also runs a really unique program that's a strategy competition that's held every year during the Jim Thorpe Days game. And so when he arrived at the Army War College, he saw all these individuals coming from all the other war colleges to compete in soccer, basketball, marbles, and other stuff. And he said, hey, we're an academic institution, why don't we have an academic competition? And so he put together this strategy competition that goes over about 3 days. There's teams from the different war colleges, both U.S., international, and also policy schools. And they have a competition. And they have judges that are both practitioners and scholars that judge the winner. And I think this month will be the second iteration of that.
That's correct.
But besides being an academic, he's also a practitioner. And so Tino spent 30 years in the Army as both an armor officer and then later a strategist. His last job before he went back to academia was as the Chief of Plans for Army North. And so he's served as a practitioner at all levels. He's been an academic. For his academic background, and one of the things I wanted to mention as a practitioner, we have a design program here. As you all know, Tino has been one of the most voiceful proponents of design from the early days of design when he was stationed as a professor at the Army Command General Staff College. And so he's written extensively on design and implementing design in a practical way as part of conceptual and detailed planning. He has a BS from the West Point. Please don't hold that against him.
Polish, Joe.
Please mute your mics.
He has an MA from Indiana University and the Army War College and a Ph.D. in political theory from Indiana University. His research focus is on the integration of political science, political theory into military planning and strategy, political, military, and strategic judgment, military design, as I mentioned, and military ethics. He has published in numerous journals to include Perspectives on Politics, Journal of Military Ethics, Peace Review, and Armed Forces and Society. A little bit about the mentorship that I mentioned before. I met Tino as a young major, I guess about 13 years ago. I am over 22. When I was at Command General Staff College. And he led a program called the Local Dynamics of War. And I like to, he influenced me in my way of thinking of the role of education for the practitioner. And I wanted to tell one story, I don't know if you remember this, that I think captures this. We were doing an exercise, and if anyone's familiar with military exercises, they normally go, the way they normally go is you split up into staff sections, you get the problem, and you immediately go to your computer and start making your J2, J3, or J5 slide so you can present. So it's about the product development. He said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to focus on product. We're going to focus on framing the environment and understanding and get that collaborative understanding. Stuff that doctrine says we should do, but we normally don't do. He then pulled me out of the class and took me over to another seminar and goes, just watch. And we stood there about 15 minutes and he pulled me aside and said, what did you see? And I said, well, I saw what I normally see in exercises, people building slides. He said, well, what were they using? I go, well, they were using the CIA World Factbook and putting percentages and stuff down. And he said, okay. And he said, well, why is that stuff important? And he goes, it might be, but why in this context is it important? And have they understood the problem? And it hit me all of a sudden. It's like the problem is we're so focused on products and not understanding, or building, or even longer term, building empathetic leaders who are critical. And so with that, I became a big Tino Perez fan. So now you didn't come here to listen to me, so I will now turn over to Tino Perez.
Oh, thank you very much, Dave. That's a very nice introduction. Thank you so much for the work that you did to get me here. I think this is a special place, the mission that you have for providing education and training within the special operations community at this time, where we don't exactly know where the enemies are going to be. We think we have an idea on Russia and China especially, and we talk about terrorism still, but we still don't know. And I think the special operations community has a central part in trying to figure out how best to prepare for the next war. I'm proud also to be at Ike Wilson's university. I had the privilege of teaching with him and being with him at the U.S. Army War College. And then I'm especially pleased to see your provost, Dr. Amy Lonis, here as well. Can you hear me in the back? I can speak louder. And I got the pleasure of meeting you, helping us select our provost at the U.S. Army War College. So I want to give you some scattered thoughts today that I think will make a coherent argument. I think what I'll say is somewhat provocative, at least among many in the military education community. So don't hesitate to critique once we're done. But I think it will be of some use. First, I'd like to share some of my motivations for why I think that military education is important. And then these are the things that motivate me. So the first one is the integration of scholarship. And it's political science, but it's also history, it's also psychology, also economics, insofar as those disciplines can help us as military professionals do our job better. Right? And this became stark for me when I came back from Iraq after the surge. It was March 2007 to like June, July 2008. And the problems that I faced there were not the ones that were described in the train up for units going to Iraq. They weren't described in the doctrine, FM 3-24, the versions of it that were coming out that we were reading. I was also at Fort Leavenworth when then General Petraeus was there putting this thing together. So we were all talking about counterinsurgency, but it just didn't match what I saw. And when I came back, I stumbled upon a scholar named Stathis Kalivas, who I consider now the dean of Civil War scholarship. And he was starting essentially a school, a movement within political science, training young scholars, men and women, to go out into the field, to gather microdata, and to produce granular understandings of what's going on there. I'll talk about some of that a little bit later. Another motivation is this idea of strategy as performance. Now, I'm going to talk about strategy today, and within the context of the U.S. Army War College, we're concerned about educating and training lieutenant colonel promotables and colonels and some diplomats, development aid workers, etc., to interact with policy. But when you see strategy here, you can also think about strategic thinking. That is, how do we accomplish the ends that we want to pursue at whatever level, given the stuff that we have to do it? How do we configure that stuff? But this idea of strategy as performance gets to the point that although strategy is a discipline, and we can read about it, ultimately it's about interventions in the world to make it a better place. And if that's true, if it's a practice, if it's a performance, then there's no way you can become competent at it or skilled at it simply by discussing the great books on strategy. Any more than you could become competent at chess or golf or math or music simply by talking about it from a book. So that we actually have to build strategy, engage in strategic thinking as often as possible in the classroom. Another motivation, which is related, is this complication, this blurring of the distinction between education and training. And Dave, I know you're working on something on this right now, so I'm going to complicate that a little bit. I get what people who distinguish between the two want to say. You know, training is like going to the range, how to fire a rifle or a pistol, but educating is what we do in the university. But if it's true that education entails things like research, reconciling research that has competing claims, making an argument from that research, convincing others that your argument is worthwhile, and then navigating the various corridors in order to make your chosen strategy the strategy that's actually accomplished, those are skills. And if they're skills, the only way to get better at them is to train them, to do them repeatedly. And so education entails training. Within the discipline of political science, when people introduce themselves, they'll often say, I'm trained as a political theorist, or I'm trained as an Americanist. I'm trained as a historian, is a common expression, which means that training is a part of their Ph.D. development. Max Weber also talked about training as a critical part of scholarship. So the two aren't dichotomous, that there's a relationship between them. I also think it's important to cultivate students' cognitive maps. I'll describe why in just a little bit. But the thing is that all the stuff that you're teaching students in the classrooms, you want that to stick. You're crafting syllabi because you think that the things that you're teaching are going to make a difference to that student who's trying to understand what's going on in the environment. And if it's not accomplishing that purpose, either directly or indirectly, then what's the use? So when your students confront a problem way after graduation, you would hope, as an educator, that they would draw on some of the things that you talked about in the classroom. Right? So we'll get a little bit more depth in that. And then this is my current challenge right now, is how to think about due diligence. It's an ethical consideration, but I think it's too easy to say it's about ethics, right or wrong, better or worse, evil, just, whatever, that there's some analytical component to due diligence as well. And I don't think we, as a profession, as educators, have really thought through that, or at least I haven't seen it yet. So here's some findings from a study that Dr. Megan Hennessy, who worked at the Army War College, now she's at Air University, Brandy Jenner, and Dr. Amanda Cronkite. We did it, 4 PhDs. Is it still there? In 2019, we took 2 seminars of the War College. It was April, so all the core instruction had been complete. Now they were in electives. We split the 2 seminars in half, so we had 4 observations of 8 persons each. They're in different classrooms. And we gave them a problem. I think at the time it was on Syria. Come up with a U.S. Policy and strategy for Syria, unpack the military component. Remember, the Army War College is a school for training strategic thinking and strategy. And so we gave them the problem, and what we did is we practiced ethnography. We had 1 PhD in each classroom, and we're just taking notes exhaustively. After 15 minutes, I was dead tired. I don't know if I recommend doing this again, but it's a lot of work. But just taking notes exhaustively. And after the time, we're trying to look for general trends. Here's the trends that we saw, and they're troubling, I think, from an educational standpoint. So one of them is students did not apply the stuff that we were teaching them in the classroom to the problem. They didn't do research. They were simply going off intuition. If they looked on the internet for some kind of fact or something, it was merely a factual, how many people are here, what's the population of this. No research. Skip to the last one. There was no rigorous causal argumentation about how the world was working, what caused this problem in Syria, why was it unfolding as it was, and then given the various interventions that they were considering, how might they play out in better or worse ways? And this is what Jeffrey Miser, in a somewhat famous Parameters article, criticizing the ends, ways, means framework, said that this is PowerPoint nirvana. That just because you put it on a PowerPoint, you put objectives and they're on a line of effort and they're linked to an end state, it's going to happen. Well, this is what we saw here as well. There wasn't that link. The students neglected the ethical and otherwise normative dimensions of the problem. They just didn't address them. They didn't come up. And there's plenty there in Syria. When they were briefing, and in the audience was a commandant, the provost, an ambassador who was working for the commandant at the time, the dean, and several other faculty members. the students were really confident in their work. So when they received pushback questions, they reasserted the goodness of their analysis. And then when the evaluators, all the persons in the room were asked to fill out a rubric sheet, to fill it out, they gave them good marks. So they didn't really hold them accountable for some of the questionable things that they were stating. So this isn't a scholarly version. We're trying to get it published, but you can see that this is kind of troubling. So since then, the Army War College is focused, because of the joint vision statement, on more problem-based experiential learning, and I think we're moving in the right direction. But this is something that I saw a lot at Fort Leavenworth, and then here, at the Army War College, and so I'm trying to fight against these trends. One of the ways of thinking about this then is through these hub practices, which I think compose the idea of strategy is performance. If strategy is performance, I've already described that, what does it entail? And there's lots of persons, scholars, who are trying to study what is it that composes strategic thinking, what makes good strategic performance. And they're focused mostly on individual attributes. But all of those ultimately have to feed into one of these four things if it's going to help out actual strategic performance. So one of them is causal analysis. Given the ways and the means that are available to us, how do we arrange them so that we achieve efficacy? So that what we want to achieve in the world actually comes about. These are means, ends questions, but specifically causal or instrumental questions. So this is an integral part of military education. When we arrange our bombs and bullets and other interventions, do we think they're going to have the effect that we hope? The other part of critical thinking here, so causal analysis, is normative evaluation or normative thinking, which is how do we choose the best ends to pursue? And this is what we categorize in terms of good or bad, evil or just, better or worse. You can't apply the same techniques in analysis as you do to normative evaluation. So that takes skill. Should we go to war in this case? Is it in our national interest? Having provided Ukraine with some armament, do we now provide them with jets and more armament? These are normative questions that entail causal analysis, but they're fundamentally normative. Students need to practice doing that. They're just not going to get better at it when they're chosen to be a four-star general. Coalition building, whether it's in a small room like this, coming up with a strategy in the classroom, whether it's in a planned section at SOCOM in the J5, or whether it's among various multinational headquarters and allies. How is it that we build consensus around the thinking that we've done? What do we give up in order to gain certain things? That's a skill, an interpersonal skill. And then all of this, the other three, are only possible through research. And research for the practitioner is nothing other than perspective taking. When you have a given problem, are you consulting scholars? Are you consulting practitioners who have worked in that area? Are you consulting diplomats, development aid workers, NGO reps, stakeholders who live in the area? Or are you just consuming what's coming down through the hierarchy in terms of an intel analysis? So these four elements compose strategy as performance. Now a little bit about my program, the Carlisle Scholars Program. We're going to go a branding change. I'm trying to change the name to something else, but this is what we have for now. The first purpose of the program is to have a space for innovation and experimentation and education on the part of both students and faculty. So we underwrite risk in the program. If you think something's going to work, let's try it out. Benjamin Jensen wrote about this in a book of his on how you get innovation in the military. He called these incubators. You need incubators in order to have these innovations tried out. The second purpose is student-focused. This program is useful for students who want to do research on one or two questions related to national security and military affairs. There's really no other place to do that in a sustained way with funding and time at the War College. This is the place to go. There's other benefits to other programs, but this is what we give. And the idea is that when they do research for clients outside the war college, that it's not developmental for the students, they've already done that, that it's actually value added for the clients, so that the work that they're doing helps them out. And so far we've been pretty successful at doing this. The principal outcome occurs partly in January, but then definitely by the end of the academic year, when I could put them in a room like this. I could give them any problem, organizational, what should the future force be, what do we do with Ukraine or China, and they know how to self-organize immediately, they know how to do research, they know how to work through strategy formulation in order to come with an outcome. And the only question is, how much time will you give them? If you give them a little bit of time, they'll use it to the max ability. If you give them more time, I think that the quality of their work will rival that of anybody else at the unclassroom. That's a bold claim. It's a bold claim. All right, so right now I'm thinking about due diligence. These are some of the things that are in my mind. But we've all heard of this idea from Elliot Cohen of the unequal dialogue between military leaders and civilian leaders. The military leaders have people like colonels and majors working on their staffs that need to understand what it is that the four-star general is going through. But how does the military, how does a policy maker, how do they comport themselves within this unequal dialogue that Elliot Cohen talks about? There's ethical dimensions to this from James Dubik and James Murphy. Phil Zelikow has a piece in Texas National Security Review where he says, you know, in our policy schools, where we're training civilians to become policymakers, they're not doing a good job at this, at the analysis necessary to inform the civil-mil dialogue. We're not doing well. You saw my critique of military education so far. Steve Biddle at Columbia talks about strategic malpractice, that if you don't do due diligence, you're really putting service members in harm's way, you're endangering the political success of our operations, and this also has whole of government implications. The key point here comes from James Murphy, and this is what's driving me right now, is this quotation at the top. I'll read it. Governmental failure to evaluate the probability of success properly is a failure in prudence. Certain kinds of failure or carelessness shade into negligence, and negligence can be morally culpable. This is what's driving me now. If it's possible in the military classroom and integrating scholarship and practicing rigorous analytical techniques to increase the efficacy of our military interventions and perhaps save service members' lives and the lives of those non-combatants who live, work, and play where military professionals operate, then we owe it to the United States people to do these things. And it's hard. If you think about a surgeon, after undergraduate education, a surgeon undergoes about 7 years of training to become a surgeon. When a surgeon operates, only one life is in the balance at any one point in time. When a military professional makes a decision, anywhere from 3 to 30 to 300 to 3,000 lives are in danger. At the highest levels, entire political communities are in danger. And how much education do we put there compared to the surgeon? So I think we need to think a lot about the analytical requirements of the military profession. I think the due diligence is an ethical issue, so that's the wholesale part of it. There's an obligation, but it entails analysis. So one of them is perspective taking along several environments. I'll describe that in a moment. It entails putting those different theories that describe the environment together to create a causal map, and then applying consensus building techniques and creativity to make solutions. Creativity in the military education context means creating solutions for problems. And there's some folks in, I think it's Army Research Institute, who have looked at various syllabi and requirements for students in military education. And they report that they seldom see create, design, or construct as the first word in a learning outcome. So if we're not doing that as practitioners, maybe it's worthwhile, critiquing ourselves on that. So I often give this talk, this part right here, to students, and I say, which one's more important, the environment or guidance? And you'll get a range of remarks. I'm not going to do that here. My argument is that the environment takes precedence. The guidance was produced from higher because of something going on in the environment. When the environment changes, the guidance is going to change as well. But if part of the military profession's role is to provide military advice to higher levels, whether it's an S3 to a battalion commander, or whether it's a combatant commander to the Secretary of Defense or the President, that requires that commander, that leader at the lower level, to read the environment, because it's not the same environment as the one described in the J2's analysis coming from higher. So you need to do your homework. That's how you provide the advice. Now the problem is that for the military professional, there's lots of environments. If you think about Ukraine, you think about China, you think about terrorism, there are dynamics in every single one of these environments that affect that problem. So what is complexity in our context? In our context as military educators, complexity comes when dynamics in each of these environments come together, configure, crystallize in such a way as to create complex problems for us, ill-structured problems for us. This is where the complexity comes from. And this is why Richard Betts said, is strategy an illusion? Because when you start to dig into all the academic theories that inform the stuff that's going on here and the practitioner narratives of what's going on here, it's easy to say, what's the use? Because you think about the US track record, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria with NATO, Libya, there's a lot of strategic discontent. Can we do something better? Right? So it can become disheartening. You can succumb to despair as a military professional or a policymaker, but we don't have that right. That's not what we do. So if there's different theories and you think about your syllabi, I bet you when you read your syllabi that they inform on each of these. You want that stuff, that substance, to stick in your students' heads, so that when they confront the problem, they know how to approach it. So how do we think about this activity? One of them is, well, reasoning. There's 3 types. 2 of them I'm going to argue are scientific, and one of them I'm going to argue is best for the practitioner. And this is what we're trying to do in class. So this is scientific deduction. We have a theory. We create hypotheses off that theory, and we try to test it in different cases. Here's why insurgencies arise, for instance. Here's why terrorism occurs. There's different theories. They disagree with each other. Some are complementary. But then we try them out in different cases, and that's what scholars do. But we're not scholars. I mean, the people whom we're training. Practitioners are not scholars. We're not trying to build PhDs. The other side of this is inductive reasoning, which is what we're going to look at several cases of terrorism, of insurgency, or whatever, and we're going to try to discern what's common among them, and then create a theory that way. So it's kind of the reverse. But this too is a scientific practice. We don't do this. This is provocative. We don't do this. Even Intel doesn't do it. What we do is abductive reasoning. We're smart about a bunch of theories. This, by the way, is one of the famous, pieces of art ever created. We're the practitioner here. We fill our students' heads with a bunch of theories, and then when they gaze upon a real-world problem, they're deployed someplace, or they're going to deploy someplace, no one's there to make sense of it. Even the Intel analysis is not going to make sense of it when they're on the ground. So they use the theories in order to figure out what's going on. Not because the theory is going to be a one-for-one match, but the theories alert them to nouns and dynamics between those nouns that might be at play. If you've never played cricket before, and you're looking at the game for the first time, good luck trying to make sense of it. But if you have 4 or 5 experts who can tell you, here's what's going on, here are the nouns that you need to pay attention to, here's the dynamics between them that you need to pay attention to, over time you'll get an understanding of cricket. And then you try to play it, another story, performance. This is what you're trying to do in the classroom, I argue, is fill the practitioners' heads with theories, doctrines included, but it's not sufficient, in order to help discern what's going on in the environment. I'll give you an example of that. If you don't do this, then the students are just, once they graduate, are trying to rely on their intuition alone. And this doesn't work. Intuition is very useful, but it needs to be trained, cultivated, and then it becomes useful. You cultivate it throughout exploration of these theories. Okay. So let me give you an example. Let me check the time here. I'm not trying to be rude and I'm going to leave, but okay. This is an applied way of thinking about what I've been telling you. It's a paper that I have right now in draft form. And I think you'll see exactly how it is a scholarship, and the principles here help you think through how to better intervene in the world and train students to intervene in the world. Okay, so the argument that I have is something called the positional problem. It's to bring attention to this idea of the positional problem, which I haven't seen anybody write about yet, even in assessments of what's happened in Afghanistan, or recently with the anniversary of Iraq, with what's been going on in Iraq. The people who I see talking about this are the people on the ground, those soldiers who actually confronted the problems. And scholars are describing them. But the people in our community at the higher levels, and what I call the coindinistas, the advocates of coin counterinsurgency, they're not talking about this. So people in coin envision the chief problem to be the identification problem. In the battlefield, in the environment, we have to discern who is an insurgent and who isn't. And that's hard because they look like everybody else. That's the identification problem. But ground level leaders and scholars identify another problem, which I call the positional problem. So there's 3 ways of thinking about military operations. One of them is, how do you employ your weapons? And this is pretty easy, right? There's a uniformed entity on the other side, and you're trying to kill them. So where are they? On the ground or at sea? And then how do we use our stuff in order to bring bullets to bear and bombs to bear on that enemy? That's easy, okay? To understand, not to do. The next problem is the identification problem, which entails the weapons employment problem. But first, we have to discern who the enemy is. That's a little wrinkle. This is what's difficult. But there's another problem, the positional one. And it comprises 2 elements. One, as a ground level leader, how do I discern the motivations of the various actors, individual civilians, individual fighters, armed groups, communities, and even government officials? How do I discern their motivations? Because what ground level leaders see and what scholars in the Civil War community are discerning is that they're switching sides all the time for various reasons. So what happens is military leaders explicitly question, are my actions or the actions of my unit having any effect whatsoever? When those actors in the environment do something, is it because of my actions or not? Because I think they are. I want them to be. And this is this question can cause despair. What's the use? The other one is, for the military leaders on the ground, Are they super confident and perhaps hubristic about what they think is going on? Or is there some degree of a sense of fallibility and humility when they think about it? And you see this play out in different accounts of what I'm talking about. The other component then is the discernment of how best to position one's forces. Think about this. If the environment comprises actors who are switching sides, the military leader for the United States or a coalition has to be slaved to, hewing to guidance from higher. You're part of a counterinsurgency effort. These are your orders to go fight the enemy. Who is the enemy? It's switching all the time. The people who come and give me intel aren't necessarily giving me intel for the right reasons, and it could be bad intel. We know this. It happens at different levels. And then we tend to look at, our leaders do, it's documented, our enemies in a Manichaean way. They're barbaric, they're evil, they're terrorists. And this becomes problematic when now you have to ally with them and fire weapons shoulder to shoulder against another enemy, which happens, right? This is the Ambar Awakening, for example. How do you deal with this? So this is from Wesley Morgan's book, The Hardest Place, focusing on the Pesh Valley, and he's quoting soldiers here. We really didn't understand the layers and layers of local dynamics and relationships at all. These are people who have been deployed for a long time in those areas. Here's this quotation. A commander, quote, wasn't convinced that here his troops or any other Americans understood enough about what was going on within the complex coalition of insurgent factions in the Pesh to definitively conclude that any particular change in the guerrillas' behavior was a result of U.S. actions. This kind of reporting and first-hand accounts from soldiers is just everywhere, but it's scattered, and nobody's compiled it together. That's what I've tried to do. Here's the archetypal case. This is from Squadron Commander Robert Brown, Brad Brown, to those who know him. And he was the commander at the Battle of Kamdesh. So you had 400 Taliban or enemy attacked small outpost. There's a movie about it. I think it's called The Outpost. It's very good. But he had a hypothesis. He says, there's two groups fighting me. One of them is a Hig. I'm going to call them moderates, because that's what he did. And the other one's the Taliban, and they're extremists. They're both firing at my soldiers. Hypothesis number one. Hypothesis number two, and hypothesis is the word he used. If the U.S. and Afghan forces leave, we extract ourselves, those two will fight each other. And the third one is, if I can strike a deal with the Hig leader, Mullah Sadiq, give him trucks and weapons, etc., then we'll get him on the government side, and then we'll help dampen the effects of the Taliban. This is the positional problem at its heart. This isn't trying to identify who the enemy is. This is making contingent decisions, that is, decisions that could be otherwise about whom your enemy is, about who your enemy is, who your allies are, and whom you're going to marginalize. That is nowhere in the train up. That's nowhere in the discussions about human terrain teams and their purpose. This is nowhere in the discussions about the importance of cultural understanding. Ground level leaders were making the same kinds of decisions that US presidents, the dictators, the authoritarian leaders, the prime ministers make, albeit at a different scale. It's political leaders at the highest level who choose enemies, not ground level ones. This was going on throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. This is what Brown said. No one ever teaches you to ask, train up, doctrine. No one ever teaches you to ask, why is Mullah Sadiq the way he is? Brown taught with me, overlapped for a little bit at the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. He was there for 2 years, promoted early, and went on before this. He had been educated, master's degree at the London LBJ School of Government at University of Texas. He had deployed to Iraq on the ground, and he had deployed to Iraq a second time at the staff level, higher level, so he had comprehensive understanding. He was as well politically prepared an officer as you could cultivate before going to this mission. What no one ever teaches you to ask is about political motives. Why do people like the way they do? This makes me angry because the literature was out there. Ian Fishback, this is a tragic story if you Google him. But he was struggling to come up with, what am I doing here? And he came very close to describing the positional problem. But he didn't quite get there. But this is an interesting account. I'll read this. The exercise of power at the ground level means not dominating an external world, but weaving yourself into a web of relationships in such a way that those around you begin making choices that take your wants and desires into account. This means that power, ultimately, is not about control. It is about submitting to a complex system that is out of any one person's control. This is a very sophisticated and humble way of looking at the environment. There's a scholar named Fotina Criscia. She wrote the book Alliance Formation in Civil Wars. It talks about a lot of the side-switching behavior. And she says, the military puts a lot of weight on cultural awareness, and properly so. She says you can never overestimate the importance of cultural awareness. But she then starkly states, cultural awareness is not the same thing as political understanding. Political understanding is attempts to explain why people do what they do. And military professionals, I would think, especially special operators, in the environments where special operators work, need to have this. And it's not in the doctrine, it's in the scholarship. There are lots of scholars describing the dynamics that soldiers on the ground saw. But as far as I can tell, there's very little relationship between these scholars, and there's so many others, and the military professional in the classroom. I can share the works with you if you want that my students find the most useful. So who's talking about this stuff? Well, U.S. Joint Doctrine, the latest revision of JP 3-24, it was reviewed in 2021, had a couple, 3 or 4 references to side-switching behavior, but it was super modest. It was epiphenomenal, not important. Whereas to these soldiers I'm describing, it was very important. It was a central experience. Counterinsurgency theorists, I teach with John Nagel and Conrad Crane and others. I'm eager to find critiques on the part of COIN advocates of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the critiques of Afghanistan will be that, we didn't hew closely enough to the doctrine. We didn't practice it well enough. Or our allies, like Germany, didn't execute COIN the way the headquarters wanted it. Interesting. The doctrine was perfect, but we didn't hew closely enough to it. Other reasons, Pakistan, I don't disagree there. And then presidential administrations and others, political leaders, and their due diligence. That's also something we need to look at. Right. There was a podcast on Afghanistan held out of the Modern War Institute at the beginning of the year. It was Doug Lute, former ambassador, 3-star general, Kyle Atwell, a counterinsurgent experienced, and Jason Lyle, a superb Civil War theorist, who's also published with Ike Wilson, actually. Jason Lyle and Kyle Atwell were doubling down on the importance of the identification problem in the classrooms at West Point to study Civil Wars. It's so important for them to understand the identification problem. No, I'm pacing my apartment as I listen to the podcast. They're not talking about it. What Doug Lute did say is we didn't understand the local dynamics well enough. So that's on the right direction. But we're not getting to this problem of that we put soldiers in a position to be politicians. And then Barno and Bensahal, they celebrate Sean McFarland, who was the commander at the Anbar Awakening, and Mark Nutch, who went into Afghanistan to get Dostum's as an ally against the Taliban. What they do is they celebrate them for their what the authors do is celebrate those two military service members for their adaptability, and it's good that they do. But these are two experienced persons, and they don't understand the uniqueness of what they were doing, the political role. This is, to me, troubling because you're not going to be able to get a good assessment of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially the latter, until we start looking at these accounts. So the implications for this are all over the place. Civil relations, especially, obviously, military education, future war. People think that, hey, we want to go to big wars. We want to focus on that. So all this human stuff we can ignore. All this political stuff we can ignore. It's always going to be military service members on the ground when those transitions happen between large-scale war and peace. They're the ones who are going to have to sort it out. And so this doesn't go away. You're always going to need it. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I'd like to open it for questions. We have about 45 minutes. And so both in person and online. So any questions?
The question I have is, as you look at the causation, going back to your exercise where the evaluators weren't grading accurately, the lack of research by the students, what do you believe the causation was? I have some of my own ideas based off of coming up through the ranks and being in those type of environments and realizing you have time restraints, you have ultimately your goal is to graduate and get back to the operational force. So what did you see from your perspective?
I think one of the factors, that's a really good question. I think one of the factors is that teachers everywhere, not just in the military education area, but everywhere, they want to have control over the classroom. And to have control, you need to give students the reading list, because there's a sort of fear that the students are going to know something that the teacher doesn't. They're going to research something and the teacher won't know, about it, or that the exercise could go in a different direction that the teacher, kind of wanted it to go. So I don't think I've seen, other than my classrooms, the teacher give for an exercise, go do your own research for it. It's usually a scenario reference book number 1 or 2, full of all the readings, or it's on the web page, or the very best thing to do would be base reading, so everybody has it in common, or base readings, and then they have to go do research, and then share it with each other. And the teacher just needs to be ready to let go. Like, you're not an expert on everything. Some of these authors or practitioners that the students are consulting may know something that you don't, and that's okay. But then, as soon as you make that move, the students have to aggregate that research in such a way that they can start to describe the environment and then start to think about possible interventions in it. So one of them is just, the other one is we're not in a habit as a community of doing research. And I went to I was G5, Chief of Plans at Army North. There's so much written, so one of the portfolios is disaster response. There are so many centers that study disasters, and there was no relation between the two. So I tasked, one of the civilians there, and Bob Mahara, go do research on these things and find out what's relevant to the plans that we're writing. And sure enough, there was lots that was relevant. The planners were like, civilian and military, 22 of them. Their eyes opened. So we're not in the habit of doing research. There was an exercise at Leavenworth, I love this, where a pilot got up in the after-action review and he says, we don't have this problem. We haven't solved this problem for how to implement joint fires, long range, Air Force. So what do we do? And I said, stand up, do an about face, take 3 steps. What do you see right there? Joint force quarterly, stacked up, still in the plastic. What's the cover story about? Air Force, long range flyers, right? Oh, okay. Did you open it up? Did you consult it? No, it was directly bearing on what he was questioning in the AR. So we're just not in the habit of consulting that stuff. I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Yes?
I appreciate
I want to do a follow-up on that because the educators, the students I deal with, military personnel E5 to O5, actively resisting when you try to get them to do research. Run into this, and this is not an isolated incident. It's across the world. Different TSOCs, Theater Special Operations Command, I've been to, where the question that he asked you, and why do you think they do it? I got that. But when you actively try to engage them, give them the tool, personally owned devices, whatever it is, and you stop to say, I want you to do this research, and they actively stop you. And some of your slides alluded to that, saying where you give enough time and they stop early, they don't use all the time available to them. How do you, sorry about that. Sorry, outstations. What have you seen as an effective methodology for dealing with something like that?
So why is it that the actual commanders out there in the real world resist attempts to integrate research in the planning, in the work that they do? All right, so let me talk about a structural problem, maybe an institutional problem. Like, we have Collins Hall, which is where exercises occur for the U.S. Army. You have to surrender your phones just like you do when you come in here. That's where BSAP is trained. It's where the strategists for the U.S. Army, captains, majors, undergo their education. It puzzles me how it is that you can train strategists without allowing them to bring a computer in and tap into the outside world to bring that world in. Like, I couldn't do it. I said, we're gonna go somewhere else. We're gonna go to a restaurant or whatever in order to get Wi-Fi access. You have to be able to bring in that stuff into your planning. And this is a problem. It's a problem to solve, given that we work in classified environments. So how do you do that? Now, with respect to the ideation element in our leaders' heads, why does that happen? We just have to pick good leaders. And like super useful would be leaders within like the SOCOM community to say, you should be doing this. And people like in the past, McRaven, Amos, Odierno, I think they wrote that piece on, is it strategy? I forget what it was. But they were saying, we've never understood the local dynamics in any war since Vietnam. Gideon Rose says we don't understand the ends of wars going back from World War I, World War II on. And so if leaders, I remember being here in 2015 when the campus was off base, and General Votel gave the talk. And General Votel was alive. He was alert to these dynamics. And he was an advocate of something called design, which I am as well. And this is great. So you have to have leaders that do this. If you look up a Letort paper, just the first few pages of John Richardson as a squadron commander in Iraq, the way he overcame the problem of not the IED, which his soldiers were prepared to face, but the RKG-3 grenade that the insurgents were throwing into the vehicles. He goes, we're losing vehicles, and soon we're going to be losing people to this. He put 15 or 16 of the top players within the squadron in a conference room like this, and he says, fix it. And he went to the back of the room, and then he left. So he wouldn't disturb the conversation. But he was humble enough to let them work through the problem, and it worked. But you need these kinds of leaders. Vinnie Brooks was another one who was an advocate of design and this openness and thinking. So these are the leaders kind of that you want to pick. Yeah. And cultivate. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Hey, Tino, you had me thinking on it sounds like the research, when you were discussing the training versus education, the research methods is really training. It was interesting, I remember at NDU, there was this question among faculty, like, why do we have individuals do literature reviews or historiographies for historians? And in my mind, it was always about, yes, that's part of the training that makes them a better staff officer. It makes them a better planner because they know how to actually do research and what's a legitimate source and what is not a legitimate source. So I guess was that your earlier point with training and education, those kind of skill sets?
Right, absolutely. The first exercise that we do with the students, that I do with my students every year, and it's kind of easy. So they'll look at the first episode of the Vietnam documentary by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, right? And they'll watch it. It's about an hour and 15 minutes. And then go find other things about the war, go research other things. But this is painful for them. It is 2 full days, 8-hour days. It's painful for them to do this work. And you watch them over the course of the semester, and it just becomes easier and easier and easier. And then they start to become confident, like, we can do this. We know how to do this. And so that pain comes from the fact that these are skills that you're just not training. Even just to read. Remember, most of these students are coming from the field. They're not scholars. They're not reading every single day the types of things that we're giving them. So just to read, I imagine, for them, it's just like if you've never run before, you haven't run in, 2 years, and you go out to run, 2 miles. It's the intellectual equivalent of that. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks. But it sounds like what the real challenge is getting out of the way that functional units in the field create ADHD cases. Okay, they turn everybody into that person because again, these guys, and I think most of us have experienced this. When you come out of a unit, you have to learn to write paragraphs again, right? Because even before PowerPoint, it was always bullets, right? A sentence may be frequently a phrase, and conjunctions and sequencing and all of that were skills you had to relearn, and it was painful, as you're suggesting, relearning that, and the same for the research skills. We have an environment in those, in the force, in the active force, that is actively creating these ADHD leaders, and then when they come to you or come to any school, as again, all of the schools I went to, you had that same culture clash because they've all been students before. It's the work. This is not their first school. They've been to a gajillion years of school. They've written term papers. They've probably already written a master's thesis for somebody before. They can research. They've just not been doing that, and so it is no longer their go-to mode. And again, they have that trouble when they get to the force, is they've got to unlearn all those paragraphs and all those skills that you taught them, because they're going to actively unlearn those to fit into those units. And how do you get that? Because they can do it, okay? You're teaching them skills, but yeah, they actually knew a lot of those skills in a lot of cases before they came to you. They're relearning those, but how do you keep that in the force?
Right. No, that's good. There's a lot of debate at the U.S. Army War College about what is a proper writing assignment to give. So to graduate, every student has to do something called a strategic research. I call them projects. It's now SRR. I can't remember what they are. So it's strategic research requirement, SRR. And it's not even a thesis. It's not formally a thesis, but it's a 20-page paper, at minimum, 5,000 words. And so this is like a term paper in the college, or at least grad school. And then people will say, well, we're not training academicians. We need to train people who can write, 1-page or 2-page memos. And then some people will say, well, some leaders do like to read a lot. Some people will say, limit it to PowerPoint, because that's the way we consume things in our culture. So there's no agreement. I think the value of the long form requirements, the SRR that I discussed, is simply this idea of the literature review, crafting, or first of all, making students aware that this question that you want to research, like there's other scholarship and views within the practitioner community that are relevant to it. Like just to know that. You're not the first one on the scene in the 21st century in 2023. And this is kind of humbling because now you need to wrestle with them. And then thinking through how to build an argument. I'm also an advocate of debate. So last week and a half, I was in Paris, where I took 5 students to participate in debate workshops in a formal debate with students from École de Guerre. The École de Guerre students actually go and do intercollegiate debate here with colleges. It's crazy. How do you do this as a young adult, as a lieutenant colonel? But they also go to Harvard and they RUSI and they participate in events there as well. But debate also cultivates, thinking on your feet, crafting arguments, making them clear, delivering them in a clear way, and then responding to the other side. These are valuable skills. Now, in a headquarters, I tell the students, First of all, don't talk like an academic. All this stuff you're learning here is not going to work out there, so don't do it. SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies, I think gives the same instruction. Don't talk like a SAMS graduate when you go. But I do tell the students, you have to fight. You have to claw in your next assignment to make room, the space for long-range thinking, for the benefit of the unit. Because everything is pushing against it. The 50-meter target, the PowerPoint that you got to prepare for the boss tomorrow morning, the briefing that you got to give, everything fights against it. In my previous unit, my predecessor, the G5, Colonel Christian Marks, he had worked with the headquarters to break the G5 out, the long-range planners out of the G3. The resentment that causes, because you're taking smart people, civilians and military, who are very good planners and thinkers, you're taking them out to focus on long-range things. And then when there's a crunch, the gravitational pull is to bring them back in. So there's that component to the ADHD part as well. There's no way around it. The other thing is the students need to know how to do quick turn research. So the faster you become at getting and digesting material, the better you'll be as well. So we just have to do it faster. No, it's good.
So we had one question from Zoom. How do you think AI is going to influence and affect the researching and analysis issue you're addressing?
So I was in DC, it was Saturday night, and I met with someone who I met in Australia War College. I taught design there for a week, a few weeks ago. And she has a colleague who is using ChatGPT to apply this method, analytical method that she came up with in order to come up with interventions, solutions. I had been skeptical up until that dinner. And we had computers out and we're nerding out, It made me think that for the client-based research that we're doing, to have students who are trained the way we train them in Carlisle Scholars and all the academic stuff and then the techniques, and then to bring her technique into it, and then use ChatGPT to create solutions, as she said, as a starting point. And then you refine from there. I think there's a huge promise in that we're trying to look how to do that in the future. I was skeptical up until Saturday night because I didn't think that ChatGPT could create. And she showed me where her colleague was running all kinds of things through it, and there's creativity there. And in the policy sphere, so obviously it's crude, but it's going to get better, and I think we need to be on top of it. And Carlisle Scholars Program is a perfect place to do that. The military classroom is a perfect place to do that. Yeah. Good question. Thanks. Anything provocative or anything that sits uncomfortably with you, yeah, just raise it now. Don't leave angry at Tino.
The other question that you kind of raised when you were talking about, making sure that we select the right leaders. Well, a lot of times we don't have the luxury of being able to select the right students. Students show up and we're forced to educate them. Some are there willingly, some are there by directive, i.e. you will go to this course because you need it for your professional military education or your career progression. So when you get those type of students, or you get that type of environment where you have some that are eager to learn, that will do the research or go above and beyond and really delve into the research and bring back those tidbits versus those that you have to literally carry along, but you're forced based off of you will pass them. You don't have the luxury of not being able to fail them, because then it would be detrimental to their careers. You're kind of in a catch-22. Is there any recommendations or thoughts on that?
So the techniques that I've been describing here, or the so to speak, principles, which they're not really principles, just ways of thinking, an ethos of how to do education. There are other ways to do education. This is just a way that works for me and that I advocate for here. People ask, is it scalable? Because I get to pick my students. I don't meet them, except for the international fellows, but I get to pick my students through phone interviews and writing samples and all that. So yeah, I have an advantage. I have taught a normal curriculum as well, at Leavenworth and at the War College. I think it's possible to apply these techniques, and it just varies how, which students in the group are going to improve. But even in my seminar, not all students are on the same level. Some are really open to it, and even though some students picked it, you can tell that they're not as open to it. Generally, they're pretty good. All of them are pretty good. There's two problems. So you in the classroom, what do? You have to make sure that there's not a contamination of negative attitude on the rest of it. So you just have to manage that as a leader, with charisma. I mean, usually you shouldn't need charisma in the classroom, but I think in military education it doesn't hurt. Right? Max Weber said that doesn't belong in the classroom. You just teach. But at the higher level, I know that our commandant and our provost have been interested in engaging with the Army on talent management, on trying to discern with more granularity who's coming here, who's coming to the War College, and then what assignments are going to, and trying to link up the experiences of the War College with those two things on either side of the experience. I don't know where those discussions are now, but they're still going on. And I think it's an important part. So one of them is, how do you handle it in the classroom? You just have to, we can talk about that more in the future. But then that leadership component for the university or the college also has to, work on it as well. And maybe, I don't know if this is part of like your portfolio at all, but yeah, we don't get to pick our students. So, unlike a grad school program at, Columbia SEPA or Fletcher, Tufts or something like that.
Hey, to carry on with that question, Tino, I mean, when I listen to Mike and Thomas and the stuff you said, it makes me wonder, seems to be a lack of maybe a learning culture in the military, any aspect of the military. And I just point to Dempsey's 2012 white paper, point to General Milley's later, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, talks about episodic education stuff. So the question is, with that in mind, if you agree with that, how do you build a learning culture in the military? I find it fascinating. We set aside 2 hours a day, an hour and a half a day. We all did when we were in uniform for physical fitness, but there was never any kind of focus on intellectual development in the military. So how do you instill that culture within the operating force? Because they're only in PME for a short time, episodic time.
I do think that the time they spend in PME in a classroom is important, because you just have as full control as you can have in any environment there. Unfortunately, it goes back to this charisma piece. The military educator needs to render the academic theories digestible. The military educator needs to serve as a curator for that literature in the various disciplines and show the student the relevance of the theories themselves to what they do, but then also how it combines with doctrine and military decision-making practices and those other things, which is what we have to do. And that takes persuasion. And persuasion's hard. But there's also communities out there in the world that are examples of how intellectual life combines with military life, active military life, difficult military life. So the strategy bridge is a perfect example of most of the military writers, or many of the military writers, thinking about military work and how to do it better. And within the organizations where those military professionals, those authors are, that they're not punished by their leaders for publishing, that they're actually encouraged for pursuing the profession in that intellectual way. So Strategy Bridge, right now Modern War Institute, I think, is probably writing a lot of stuff that's relevant to what happens here at JSOU. The Modern War Institute is big focus on irregular war. But that's also open to military writers, right? So there needs to be a culture within our different communities of students, once they graduate, still keeping up with things like War on the Rocks and Strategy Bridge and Texas National Security Review, which is free, it's ungated, anybody can read it, and the best authors are in there, and still learning. Twitter, it's ambivalent now, but it's still, I don't get the poison that other people have gotten on Twitter. And if you're a woman, you're going to get poison. And it's just, this is well documented. But you can curate your feed so that you have people on your Twitter account who are the same persons that you would like to sit with at lunch. So what do they say about Ukraine, or what do they say about this or that given issue, about artificial intelligence or cyber or whatever? And I learn about a lot of articles and books that way. It's my scouts out, my sensors, because otherwise I'm not going to come across these things. And many times that Twitter feed will change my syllabus, based on a new reading. So we need to do it as educators, keep up to date, but the students also need to leave with sufficient interest to engage in these other fora. Yeah, thanks.
I wanted to come back to that phrase that has come several times, client-based research. And, I think we've all experienced that. It's a great idea, but those juicy questions aren't really forthcoming. So how are you doing with that? Who's most forthcoming, commands or commanders? And what's the nature of these juicy questions?
So every year it's a different group. Sometimes so the students, when I interview them in the summer, so I'll be doing this in about a month or 2 months, are you interested in a research question? Are you good with working with others? Because some people aren't. Some people only work, by themselves. Some people don't want to research anything. They just want to get by. And that's okay. But are you willing to go find a client that might match with your interests? The burden is on the students. These are lieutenant colonel promotable colonels. They've done big things with lots of people under their commands or their organizations. They can do that. So many times they'll come with links. So we had a James Little, as Department of State officer who'd worked ground level in several crisis areas in Africa, worked at the Africa Bureau for Department of State, and then National Security Council. So he had links, National Security Council, two research questions, where he had a group of students, colleagues, and just filling those out. One of them related to the benefits of security cooperation. That's the one that I remember most right now. Tim Gatlin, former White House fellow, I think he's DeVarty Commander of 1st Cav right now, but he had links to another White House fellow, a 2-star general, and to Khalilzad. And so we did some research for him that he used, and he wanted more of, but we had to cut him off because the students had other obligations to do. He was asking for it much earlier in the year. Futures Command, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which has since gone away, work there. Right now I have students that have traveled to Latvia and Estonia to interview ground level military personnel on interoperability, and they're reporting to Lieutenant General Landrum, 3-star at NATO Military Command or something. I forget the organization, but they're going to report here later on this month in Brussels on those findings on interoperability. And it's that will serve as a basis of a lot of discussions that Lieutenant General Landrum has. So there's no certainty from year to year that they're going to be quality or that there's going to be good access. But we've never had a problem with that. That's, by the way, an area that we're trying to improve. So one of my colleagues has a course called Consulting on Leadership and Management, which combines strategic leadership and defense management issues. And he's trying to, next year, mentor them a little bit more on how they're doing their work. So we have a whole list of these things over the years if you'd like to talk about it. But it is possible, but the burden's on the student. I don't have those links. I don't want those links. Yes.
I'm Kimberly Urban, culture anthropologist, also an academic from here. I wanted to follow up a little bit on your slide. It's similar to one that I use when I teach structured analytic techniques. The one that we actually had three. You talked about the deductive and I want to talk about specifically the abductive, because it seems like that one in particular, if we are using that kind of reasoning, it would be much easier to introduce our own biases and own backgrounds, our own, unique perspectives. If you could just talk a little bit about that, because that will color our world and the solutions that can come up, for problems. I've seen this all over the world. People coming at a problem set with their own unique backgrounds and finding it difficult to divorce themselves from their background and trying to see things from the perspective of, say, the local population.
Sure, that's very good. I'm not going to go to the whiteboard because the temptation's there. So right away, the first lesson includes readings from Séverine Althusser, who has several books, but one of them is Peaceland, where she criticizes what she calls peace builders. Politicians, diplomats, senior military leaders doing peace building missions, NGO reps, development aid workers, etc. Everybody's trying to get peace. And she says one of the things that they evince in their work is, first of all, a tenuous causal argumentation in their interventions, but they also have a macro bias, and they ignore local dynamics. So this points them towards a perspective taking that is one of the hub practices. We hammer this. In the same lesson, they get what they're going to be consuming for the rest of their time at the War College, which is Craig Parsons' argument about causal logic. Craig Parsons wrote a book, How to Map Arguments in Political Science. And the idea is that there's 4 types of causal arguments that you can make: structural, I'm not going to, institutional, psychological, ideational, but the psychological is the one that seizes upon the arguments of Danny Kahneman and Richard Thaler and Dan Ariely and other behavioral economists that say that there are universal hardwired aspects of being human that lead to irrational decision making, almost always. So anchoring bias, availability, fundamental attribution error, etc. These are all, they're not unique to a community, but they belong to everybody. And there may be types of people who are more susceptible or not. Think of, what's that personality thing? I'm MSR, I forget there may be types of people that are more susceptible, but generally everybody in every era, man or woman, regardless of identity, is going to be susceptible to anchoring bias. There are other types of biases that are ideational, that relate to your community. And so the best way, I think, to dampen those is first be aware of what they are, but then also work collaboratively. This is what bothers me about people who try to assess strategic thinking as an individual thing. I can have 5 basketball players optimized for speed, strength, shooting prowess, all those things, but you put them together, and it doesn't mean they're going to win. So how do you then take those high-performing individuals and put them in a collaborative environment where they can produce solutions, and I know this is problematic, solutions to problems out there. And so that communal aspect is what dampens some of these biases, but there's no guarantee. This is why we teach first step. You're probably going to get something wrong. You have to recognize it, be humble, and then go into it. Does that help? But now biases are central to the students' thinking, both ideational and psychological throughout. But you're still talking to me, even though I'm talking about cultural understanding, and so this is good.
Definitely clicked a few of us just with the Final Four and the basketball playoffs, teams.
Yeah, teams, exactly.
I think we have time for one more question. Hey, Tino, thank you very much for a great presentation and for sharing your thoughts on educating the practitioner.
Thank you so much. Thanks.